All right, so we were talking about Taco Bell, and speaking of Taco Bell, let's talk about people on the move. So, another way of looking at this is this: you're always on the move. Maybe not so much anymore because we're on lockdown. So let's think back about a year ago, and this map is kind of a geographical way of looking at that. This looks at your map not only in space but in time, right? So let's just say right here, I am at home until right here, from when I wake up at 8 o'clock in the morning, and then I leave home at about 10 o'clock. And at 10 o'clock, I drive to work. And then I'm at work from, 11:30 to 5. And then I go out with some friends and have a drink. So I'm in this place for so many hours. I'm in this place for so many hours. I'm in this place for so many hours. And maybe you were here, and then here, and then here. So your daily ritual, right? It's constrained by time because first of all, you have to be somewhere for a certain amount of time. You have to be at work, you have to be at home. That's part of it. And your access. They call these prisms. How big is this square? How far is home from work? And that is a lot of things, right? So work is going to be close to home, unless you are, a billionaire and can fly in your private jet. For the most part, right, this is going to be constrained by the ability for you to get from home to work and your activities, right? If you go on vacation, then you have to go outside of this box, and then you go to that peg very, very rarely. But for the most part, your pegs all fall within this prism that is defined by many things. If you live in a city, right, it takes a lot longer to get across the city than it does in the country, so your peg is smaller, maybe physically. But if you have a car, it's even bigger because if I told you this, if you didn't have a car, then how you get to school downtown, probably the train or the bus is going to limit where your home is, right? But if you're driving and could park, you could have a bigger prism. This is actually interesting. This whole model of space-time geography and people on the move is now being used for contact tracing. Contact tracing. This is a new thing with the coronavirus epidemic. And what it is we are tracing everybody's movements, right? So here we go. This is a family's bundle. They all start here at home. This person goes here for a while there. They all go there, right? But what if this person right here has COVID? We find out that this person tested positive for COVID. And we look, and they were right here. This little spot right here. What is this? So contact tracing would say this person was here, this peg, so was everybody else that was in that group. So basically, imagine this. I am here with my family. I come to school. I am sick. So this period of time when I'm in the classroom and I'm sick, who am I exposing my sickness to? Who is this? All these other people in my room. And so contact tracing means that you try to find out who all these people are and get a hold of them. Because every one of them might have another contact. So it's funny, this whole concept was something that was not really covered much, and now it is front page news. There are other types of movements of the people, seasonal movements. There are still large parts of the world where people move, they follow their animals. Transhumance is this movement when people who herd animals like sheep in the summer, they move higher up in the elevation, and then in winter, as it gets colder, they move back down. They move from different pastures, or they follow their herds of animals. The people who live in Siberia follow their herds of reindeer, still do this. There's a lot of rural to urban migration. People maybe live in the country during the harvest season, harvest the vegetables. You hear about migrant workers and then go home to the city during the winter. Or circular. What about the people who have the money to, on vacation during the winter time? They'll go down to Florida for a couple months in the winter. They'll go someplace cold in the summer, or they go everywhere for spring break. Right? This idea of vacation is a movement. We can even look inside a city. Okay? So first of all, suburbanization, and let me go back and just go this. This is the most recent movement. People moving from the center of the city out to the suburbs. And that has been the dominant trend in American urban movements for the last 60 years. Although in the last 10 years, we've seen more people moving back into the city. But there's another one too. What about movements within metro areas? So this is a map of downtown Chicago. And each block represents the population of that area. And you can see the loop, a lot of people. And think about it, when we're downtown during the day in class, right? All the buildings, all the skyscrapers full of people. But what happens at 5 o'clock? Everyone leaves. right? If you've ever been down by Harold Washington at 6 or 7 o'clock at night on a weeknight, it's a lot different, a lot less people. Not many people actually live downtown. Most everyone takes the train or the bus. And so at night, the population actually drops. So think about that. Chicago has a population of 3.5 million people. But they factor in, they think that during the day, if you factor in the people that are here, if you were to count the population at noon in the middle of the day and count who is actually in Chicago, it could be as high as 8 or 9 million people. And at night could be as low as 2 million people. One of the biggest movements of people that we've seen in human history, and it has really kind of come to a head, is this idea of the rural to urban. People are moving to cities, especially in the last 50 years. We've talked a little bit about the role of technology making farming easier. You don't need as many farmers to feed people, and there's not much work left in farming, so people are moving there for more jobs and more opportunity. But I think it was only 10 years ago that if you look at the Earth's population for the first time in human history, more than half of the Earth lives in cities. And that's a huge change. We see this happening most strongest in countries that are beginning to move from the periphery to the core. They're beginning to modernize. They have a huge amount of growth. Okay. We also see that when people move to the city, even if they're in that country, so if somebody from the United States moves from a rural area to a city, even then, cultural identities remake by the city. They're remade. Immigrants are remade by moving to cities. And they call this the Chicago School. Back in the 1920s, sociographers from the University of Chicago were studying immigrants and people moving into cities from around the world, moving to Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, and they were documenting the change that happened. And what happens is, as people move from places like Ireland and Germany and Russia to the United States in the 1920s and moved to cities like New York and Philadelphia and Boston and Chicago, they became part of this large urban city, and they assimilated. They kind of lost some of their old ways and became part of this new, not American, but an urban society. Now, until now, we've been talking about voluntary migration. There is the unfortunate flip side of forced migrations. People are forced to move. And the biggest one, most significant one, is the global slave trade, specifically the era between roughly 1500 to 1900. And this is the movement of people from Africa to South and North America and the Caribbean. The slave trade was actually part of a larger economic pattern where slaves were brought to the New World to work on the plantations and create goods, either farm goods or manufactured goods, which were then sold back to Europe and allowed for the capital there to be invested to bring more slaves. Extremely significant. We estimate, because we have no way of knowing, that at least 6 million died over this period of 3 centuries, and that 11 million people were taken. And that is a huge number. A huge number. It is almost impossible to separate out the influence of the population movement. It decimates several areas of Africa. People are just being drained, taken away. And as we talked about that before, when people choose to leave, it can be a drain. But when people are stolen away, even worse. And I don't think you can really truly imagine any country in the Americas that their culture does not have some influence from the African American population, right? But the big thing that it really did was the wealth. The labor of the African slaves that was taken from them, because when you're a slave, right, you don't own your labor, someone owns you. But that labor was used to build wealth that accumulated in the United States and Europe. So the United States, many times you'll hear this phrase that slavery is our original sin. And one thing that I think we're still facing to this day is the fact that the wealth and power of this country, in large part, was originally built off the stolen labor of African Americans. Slaves built the White House and the U.S. Capitol, right? I was taught in high school that slaves worked in the cotton plantations down south, and they made the cotton planters rich. But after the war, the cotton planters lost all their money because their slaves were freed. But what they don't tell you as much is that the cotton that was grown in the South, the money that the people who owned the slaves made from selling the cotton, was used to invest in factories in the North. And so the first round of industrialization was funded by money earned from slave labor. And so our growth as an industrial nation, that was its kickstart, was slavery, right? Today, it still happens. We're still seeing this. The largest event today that causes it, not so much the slave trade, but more conflict, war, unrest. If you're in a country where people are fighting and you have a greater risk of dying, you're gonna go somewhere where maybe you're safe. It's the main reason people leave, and it creates international refugees, approximately 20 million, and even more so, internal refugees, or people that maybe don't leave their own country, but within their own country move, and that's as high as 38 million. So here's an example. This area right here in the Horn of Africa, a lot of unrest. There's a civil war in Yemen. The country of Somalia has basically dissolved into various factions of armed criminals. Ethnic conflicts right here in Kenya and Ethiopia. Large areas of Ethiopia, people have actually fled other areas and end up here, right? And then we also have economic refugees, right? So maybe they're not facing so much physical harm, but if the opportunity is better somewhere else, then they do that. So some of the characteristics with that is that it is voluntary, and we do think that 3% of the world's population are actually economic refugees, economic displaced persons, and half of them are women. Many people who migrate for economic reasons are temporary. They go to work for a couple years, and one of the things they'll do is they send money back, which is called remittances. Okay? So a remittance is, if you're a temporary migrant, you're working, you pay you pay for your room and your board, and then you send the rest of your money back home. This just shows you how much money was sent, and this is I want to say 2016, how much money was sent to various countries from people in the United States. You can see that Mexico, $28 billion was sent back from the United States, right? So large amounts of dollars. Some countries, like Guatemala and the Dominican Republic, a big part of their economy depends on money sent back from the United States. So somebody from Guatemala who is here working and sending back money back home, that money gets sent back, and the people back home use it to buy food, to maybe build a new home, to pay for a doctor, and that money gets pumped into their economy. In some countries in Africa, remittances from foreign countries make up almost half of their economic activity. Now, when immigrants become permanent, right, that's when we see this kind of drop off and we start seeing cultural change. So if people are here permanently, that's when you start seeing cultural change, like more interaction between the groups. I think about this idea of Mexican food, right? Mexican food today is not that uncommon, but 30 or 40 years ago it wasn't. And there's just been this huge increase. Most immigrants coming to the United States now are coming from either Central and South America or Asia. So you see more Asian restaurants around the country than you ever did. And I think restaurants are always a really good example of cultural immigration, because if people are going to be here for a long time, then they bring with them their culture, their food, and it kind of comes out. All right, we're going to stop right here for just a moment and come back with the rest of it. We're pretty close to being done, so the next part will be the last part.